Welcome everyone to, sorry, excuse me, I have a terrible cold. Our Thursday, November 8th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting with Steven Becker. We're all a bit jet lagged today, so it'll be interesting to see how this conversation shakes out. But having missed two meetings leading up to this one because of travel complications, I think that we're all looking forward to jumping right back into it. So I'm not going to have a big preamble because I'm sick and I can barely talk. So, Stephen, I'm going to hand this off to you immediately. You want to take it away?
Sure, not a problem. To be honest, I think to recap would be to try and sort of boil the ocean right now, to try and get everyone, sort of back on the page again. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right back into the sort of governance process, just to recap on what that is and what that entails from a broad point of view, because ultimately what I would like to talk about today is looking at MKR as a governance token that has value and focusing on how that actually works and how that value proposition is in the hands of MKR token holders and no one else. So just again, to go over the governance process, it's pretty simple. The idea is twofold. One, you have a vote that is more of a resolution that doesn't actually create any change in the state, and that is obviously the governance vote. And just to recap on that, the governance vote starts off with a big discussion, generally in social media, and that eventually leads up to a point where a proposal gets placed into the voting structure, and then people vote on that particular proposal, either a simple yes or simple no. And obviously, if it wins, then that resolution gets passed. Now, a good example of that is if you wish to vote in a new risk team, if you wish to vote in a new oracle, then it's really a case of saying yes or no. And if it passes, then it gets recorded and that risk team or oracle is included. Now, why is this important? Just keep in the back of your mind, like I said previously, discussing these points on social media and then resolving it using a governance vote is just a way of reducing contention. It's just a way of increasing the probability that a proposal will pass before it actually gets placed onto the voting structure. The other thing you got to keep in mind is that other than your simple yes/no proposals, most of the proposals that you put on the voting structure will be scientifically vetted. It will have a certain level of scientific rigor behind it that sort of defends itself against any sort of contentious property that you might get from sort of rival factions in the voting structure. Okay, so that's governance. We understand that. Executive voting is actually the final step after a governance vote for something that has to change the state of the system. And that is a continuous approval voting, which requires constant attention as to how one goes about governing this whole system. A good example of that is that once we have voted in certain collateral types, then we need to figure out what those risk parameters are going to be for that collateral type and execute it and place it onto the blockchain for us to use. So that is the sort of simplified rundown of where we are with respect to the governance process and how we can generally understand it.
Now, can I ask a quick question here?
Sure.
Sorry, I don't know if I understood that correctly. Did you say that we could vote in a collateral type and then there'd be another vote afterwards to determine the risk parameters, or is that all rolled up into one process? One single
No, what happens is that the governance process with respect to the collateral type will come with a pre-assessment, a qualitative and a quantitative assessment of that collateral type. So if I said I want to vote in, token ABC, along with it will be a preliminary assessment of the quality of the token and then a sort of preliminary assessment of the quantitative figures that are attached to it. So once the governance vote has passed that particular collateral type, then everyone will be very much aware of what those risk parameters are. And then in the executive vote, that's where you vote for those risk parameters to actually take effect. So,
okay, well, that's interesting. Do we, sorry, I know that these, well, I'm not sure if it is early days or not, but are there examples of what these proposals will look like, or is there a template that we'll be able to take a look at before we start voting on things, or will we kind of test the process in motion?
yeah, so what's going to happen, well, this is the thing though, is with any proposal, you're going to have 2 weeks of looking at the proposal and having a look at the links to all the explanatory documentation as to what the proposal means, what the effect of it is going to hopefully create, and discussion will start around it. So for a governance vote, it'll be 2 weeks of discussion, and after 2 weeks of discussion, if we find that there really is no point of contention, then we can open up that governance, that proposal up to a governance vote, and that'll last for 2 weeks as well. These are just preliminary ideas. The time frames may change, but I'm just going with 2 weeks and 2 weeks. So in the next 2 weeks, what we aim to do is obviously vote on it appropriately and effectively try and have that proposal pass. But that first 2 weeks is essential. That's where the discussion starts, because you might find in those 2 weeks that this proposal is not going to move. So what you may want to do is then submit a new proposal and then start a new point of discussion. So you don't need to wait 4 weeks to find out if something's going to fail. You could find out within the first 2 weeks if something's just not gelling or not making sense. And a new proposal can be put in, or simply the proposal can be labeled as withdrawn. These are the sort of the options available to us. From the executive, firstly, Rich, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. I guess if there's a follow-on question, what if a proposal is put forward that has that requires a minor correction or some slight tweak? Does that need to be withdrawn and then resubmitted, and another 2 week process continues?
Yeah, basically, you think about it needed some editing, some elaboration. It could be really anything. It could be just simply withdrawn and replaced. It's easy enough. But essentially, if you have a full scoped out proposal and you've submitted it and you find that folks just generally don't like this idea at all, there's no point in going to the vote. You can actually just withdraw it and either decide that this wasn't a very good idea to begin with, or resubmit it in the new format that will actually follow along with what most people consider would be the appropriate form, I suppose, in a manner of speaking. With the executive vote, this one is different. This one is a given. So you might find that, let's say I say that collateralization ratio should be 125%, but what I meant was 135%. Can I change that? Yes, obviously I can change that. But if I give a full scope of the risk parameters and they are indeed correct, then it really is a case of just waiting for folks to put their votes onto that particular proposal and turn it into the main proposal. If you recall from the previous conversation or the previous community call that we had, by voting on an executive proposal, you're actually voting on a full change in the system from an incremental point of view. So once you put all your votes into this new proposal, then what you're saying is that you want the current state of the system plus this incremental change. So if this particular executive vote gets the majority of the votes, it basically gets submitted and deployed into the system as a new representation of the system. So that's kind of how the continuous approval voting works using an executive vote. Okay, does that make sense? Rich, are we there?
Yeah, I'm with you now. Yeah, I think that does clear it up. I'm going to take this opportunity, though, to do something I should have done at the top of the meeting, just to remind everybody that if anyone has any questions at any time, for any reason, please feel free to speak up. Either jump on mic if you have one, or type your question in the chat at the side, and I'll make sure that your questions get addressed.
So I have a quick question just to sort of try to clarify this for myself. So the two different votes are the governance votes and the executive votes. Governance votes are sort of like resolution votes, like philosophy votes, things of that nature, risk teams. Then executive votes are actually the votes that change the state of the system. So they're more concrete. And both of these votes are going to have sort of a two-step process where there's going to be a proposal that lasts for a week or two, and then there's going to be an actual vote. Does that apply to both the governance vote and the executive vote?
Yes, it should. So you will not the 2 weeks of discussion for the executive vote. You can have that, but there's no 2 weeks of actually voting on that proposal, because the executive vote is a part of the continuous approval voting system.
Oh, I see. So basically, for each parameter, there's going to be an active proposal, and if it doesn't need to be changed, then nobody's going to be voting on it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, basically, let me give you an example. So I put forward a proposal to accept token ABC. So the way I do it is I first put in, for instance, into the let's say the collateralization, the public collateralization channel on or collateral channel on Rocket Chat, and I say, guys, what do you think about token ABC? And everybody comes in and says, well, what do you think about it? Well, this is my qualitative assessment on it. This is kind of what my quantitative assessment is on it. But what do you guys think about this particular token? Do you think it's liquid enough? Do you think it's got good fundamentals? Do you think the organization is authentic? Whole bunch of discussion ensues. We take this discussion and maybe we add it onto Reddit, onto our subreddit, and folks start chiming in there as well. Go, yes, token ABC is fantastic. I got no problems with it. Yeah, that's fine too. That's awesome. Maybe a couple of tweets to tell everyone, please, jump onto the channel, jump onto the Reddit, put your comments in. Let's find out what you think about token ABC. And by the way, this is what my preliminary qualitative and quantitative assessment looks like. And so some folks might come back and go, I think you've been a bit harsh on them, or maybe you sort of giving them too much of too high a score. But after doing that, I say, okay, well, what I'm going to do is, it doesn't look like everyone hates this idea too much, so I'm going to put forward a proposal into the voting structure. And the proposal is going to be, do we accept token ABC? So I put the proposal in, and then I put links in as to where you can find information about this proposal, what my assessment looks like from a qualitative point of view and a quantitative point of view, and maybe some links to the subreddits and the Rocket Chat. And for 2 weeks, everybody keeps talking about it in the same way. There's nothing further contentious that comes up, and after 2 weeks we go, okay, cool, we need to then vote this in. So for 2 weeks, everybody votes, and after 2 weeks, we find out that there's majority says yes, and we go, great. So we've got resolution on the fact that we want token ABC included.
Well, at what point? Sorry, at what point? Sorry, I get jumping in. At what point are there initial references to potential risk parameters? Is that going to be in the initial quantitative assessment, saying that ballparking, we're thinking about this kind of a debt ceiling or this kind of a stability fee, or is there no mention of that until it's already been approved and then it goes to a risk team?
Oh no, it has to have some sort of indication from the beginning.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
So basically, would that be a resolution vote, and then after the resolution vote's added happens, there would be executive votes on the specific parameters with a far more scientific sort of approach to those. That's that set of votes.
So Okay, so let me complete the sequence. So
yeah,
we've now voted in. The governance vote has decided that this is going to be included, and we're going to do that. The reference is still going to be there to what the quantitative assessment and qualitative assessments are, and those numbers are now going to become the sort of de facto numbers that we're going to include into the executive vote. Now you must remember, the executive vote is a representation of the state of the system. That is the most important thing. And the executive vote is a part of the continuous approval voting construct. Now, the executive vote will occur let's say for now, every quarter. So if we find ourselves finishing the governance votes and the next day is the executive vote, you'll probably find that you won't have that vote happening in that quarter. It'll probably extend to the next one, because you still need another 2 weeks for people to consume this. And after that 2 weeks, then it really is a case of saying, well, there's the proposal. Everyone start voting on it. Now that 2 weeks for the executive vote, that's just my rendition. The final rendition may actually be slightly different. There may not be one. There may not be another 2 conversation. It might actually be none whatsoever. The reason being is that you would need the time between the quarterly dates to actually have this discussion. But I'm just worried that to a certain extent, folks might try and game it between the governance and the executive vote. But essentially, the executive vote is the state change of the system. And in order for that state change to take effect, you need to get a majority of vote. And that can take a long time. You might find that nobody wants to vote on it. You might find that this thing just doesn't work at all. Or you might find that folks do move from the current vote that has the majority of the current proposal that has the majority of the votes. That represents the current state of the system. So if they move from that current proposal onto this new proposal, and there's majority of them on this new proposal, what they're saying is that we would like to have the current system plus the increment of this new proposal. And once the majority is there, then that particular proposal gets triggered into an actual deployed system, given that the governance security module is satisfied, which is a 24-hour gap where we make completely sure that we didn't accidentally vote in something detrimental.
Okay, that's really cool. And maybe this is embarrassing because maybe I'm just catching up to something everybody else already understood as possible. But what you mentioned in the past that the executive voting represents the state of the system, and I didn't quite tweak to the fact that that's what we're saying, is that's the complete state of every parameter that governs our entire system, right? And so
Correct.
If we add a new collateral type, it's just changing the stability fee on a particular asset class. That vote is everything that was in the old system with the new tweak, and as people move back and forth,
yes,
that's when we decide. Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
So that means if there's like maybe 5 or 6 different risk parameters that needs to get changed in the whatever quarterly, right, theoretically executive vote, that could all be done in one single sort of vote, right?
yes. Because you must remember that the executive vote is just a way for everyone to deploy what we should have effectively agreed on already.
Right.
It's interesting though. What if there's it seems that there's some complexity here. What if one particular parameter turns out to be contentious and is potentially blocking?
Well, you see, that parameter should have been looked at and understood before it actually gets deployed. So if I put in there 125% for a particular parameter, but in the executive votes it's somehow snuck in 115%, that it wouldn't pass. Everyone will start saying, wait a minute, there's a difference between what you said the number was going to be and what it actually is. So either I've got to explain myself or I've got to correct it and go, oops, sorry, there was sort of finger trouble. But,
all right, so I think this brings something else into clear focus for me when you mentioned earlier in a previous meeting that the governance votes are expected to be some contentious, where the contentiousness exists as a possibility. There'll be debate back and forth, but with the executive votes, the expectation is basically that it's an overwhelming success. We've all agreed that this is what we wanted to do previously, and if the new executive vote doesn't pass overwhelmingly, then perhaps we need to reevaluate how the system works. Is that correct? Recap?
Yes.
So basically, it's a yes and a yes if the executive vote is configured correctly and there's no mistake. Everybody should theoretically vote yes, and the people that disagree with maybe one parameter of the 6 that we agreed on can vote no. But on the whole, if it's majority yes, it's going to pass.
Yeah, basically, think about it like this. What the whole sequence does is it increases the confidence of the state of the system being changed in a way that everyone wants. And what it does as well is it decreases the probability of any contentiousness. That's what the whole system is set up for. Is it foolproof? Does it mean that somebody can't come in at the last moment and mess things up? Nope. You must remember, this is a system whereby people are voting. So this is still a social interaction of many people in a group, and we can't determine the perfect system to make sure all people are trapped into decision. Everyone has free will, everyone has the right to change their mind. This is just a way to make sure that if we do put something forward, proposal forward, then by the time it actually gets to the executive vote, we are pretty darn sure that everybody wants this. So it really is the case that once the proposal is being placed as into the voting structure for an executive vote, we literally should see MKR tokens being transferred from the current proposal, which is the representation of the current system, into this new proposal. It should literally just be a formality. If it's not a formality, that means somewhere along the line, either something has changed or someone is trying to game the system. So that's obviously, if someone is trying to game the system, that's where the governance security module comes in. If it is horribly detrimental and someone has properly gamed the system, then the security module catches that and pretty much settles the whole thing.
Do you think that quarterly will allow enough agility for us to respond to different market pressures or the speed of crypto?
The caveat there was that the general cadence in my mind would be quarterly, but in order to make sure that the system gets enough traction, adoption, and momentum, you might have to flywheel with more frequency. It might have to be monthly. And then, eventually when it gets to a certain critical mass and a lot of people are included, 1 month may not be enough. You may find that you have to stretch it to 2 months, then eventually to quarterly. I wouldn't want it to go past quarterly because then you sort of lose the attention of the MKR token holders as a governing body.
Okay, great. Chris, you had some good questions. Did you want to read those out or should I read them for you?
Let me come off the mute. There we go. Just find the mute button.
There you go.
Yeah, really, question from me really is about, I guess, first of all, just on that very specific point, you said there was 2 weeks, I think, on the governance vote to vote. Does that mean 2 weeks that people have got to register their vote? In that time, given that there might be discussion going on, can they change their vote? Can they pull that back? Yeah.
Yes, because remember what happens is that you're effectively locking up your MKR, and then you are selecting a vote that matches your lockup of MKR. If you decide, hang on a second, I don't like this, there is going, before the vote ends, you go, hang on a second, I voted yes, but no, this sounds like it all sucks, I want to vote no. Yes, indeed, you can change it.
Okay, cool. And in terms of what goes to vote, what's the throttle on that? What's the mechanism that stops 50 things a day going to a vote, or a proposal going that needs to be voted on?
Well, you see, the thing is, the frequency of proposals entering the voting structure is actually representative of this continuity that requires consistent governance by the MKR token holders. So it really is a case of saying, well, imagine 5,000 proposals coming in a day. It's a possibility, but at the same time, those folks put in those proposals will become cognizant of the fact that they're going to not have their proposals looked at appropriately because there's only so much bandwidth the governing body, being MKR token holders, can look at. So there's going to be a natural equilibrium formed, dependent on how many people are participating in the system, as to how many proposals you can put forward. It's going to be naturally determined. You must remember that this is going to be deployed out into blockchain space, and there is no formalism around how much will be considered, because it really is a function of how people are going to consider it and when they're going to consider it. And this comes back to the sort of cost benefit of MKR tokens and where you store them. So I'll touch on that a little bit later, but for now, there isn't a limiting mechanism. It can basically be as much as possible. It's got to organically determine itself, how much can be considered at any one time. So yes, you can head it up with 100,000 proposals, almost like what's the thing called, the Sybil attack, if you wish, and all you're going to do is make sure that none of the proposals are considered.
Yeah, but okay, but at the point that a vote is created, so you can have a proposal when you've got a mechanism for a vote to take place, then you have, as you say, if you're getting 5,000 a day, in 2 weeks' time you're going to have 5,000 votes a day, and depending on the bandwidth of maker holders and the number of maker holders, and you're going to have potentially a undesirable or not, suboptimal voting process. So is that a risk that you see?
That is one of the governing risks that you have. There's two of them. One, you have a whole bunch of superfluous proposals being put forward and in large numbers. That's on the one side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, you have no proposals being put forward. So it really is a case of saying, well, keep in mind that if you are an MKR token holder, you are part of this mechanism, and your voice comes into a lot of things. And the one thing you've got to remember is that you may be inundated with a whole bunch of rubbish that you don't really want to consider, or you may be sitting looking at a blank space for a very long time before you can actually extract value out of those proposals. Now, keep that in mind when I come back to the cost benefit of where you put your MKR tokens, because the number of proposals is actually a function of value that you can extract from them, because that is essentially how you're going to determine the value that you're going to increase the whole system by. Maybe the mapping or the connection is not there yet, but hopefully through a little bit of an explanation I can sort of elucidate that point.
Are we trying to introduce a little bit of pre-filtering by the expectation is that the risk teams will be submitting these proposals, is that correct? Or do we expect that just anybody will be trying to drop contracts onto the blockchain?
MKR, this is to the second question, and who can create a proposal? MKR holders can create a proposal.
But yeah, I know that anybody can get in there, but is the expectation that primarily we'll be dealing with proposals from risk teams, or?
Yes, because essentially the main part of the system is going to be understanding what collateral you want to include. So yes, I mean, quite frankly, it should predominantly be risk teams putting forward proposals for new collateral types, how they understand those collateral types and what those risk parameters are going to be. That is essentially it. But from a broader point of view, you can submit proposals for generally anything.
Hopefully there'll be some filtering for quality. I think that it'd be tough for the average person to say, like, we should do token X because I have thousands of them, versus risk teams, financial models, and their quantitative assessments. It'd be hard to compare those two things, in a realistic manner.
It might be a case that a tool will be required to actually filter proposals for, or maybe categorize proposals for risk team contributions versus contributions from other folks, or you might want to categorize them in terms of what those proposals are. The point being is, and I need to emphasize this a lot, this is something that MKR token holders need to figure out. This is something that they need to determine. Certain tools can be put in place, but these tools are there for them to use. I'm not going to dictate how many proposals should be put in per day. I'm not going to dictate the quality of those proposals. I'm not going to dictate the sense of value that has to surpass a filter, because as soon as I start putting a filter in place, I'm censoring what can and cannot be considered. And clearly that's the last thing I want to do. But it really is the case of, in normal operations, there is an expectation that the predominant system will find value from risk teams putting forward proposals for new collateral types. you may find that there's going to be a intermediate period where people are going to consider governance votes about oracles. You may find some new discovery where pricing becomes a lot more interesting if it's done in a specific way. And we need to think about, well, MKR token holders, when I say we, I'm talking about MKR token holders, need to consider, oh, someone discovered a new way of medianizing oracles. This is great. We can actually use it. It's a lot safer and it actually provides a lot more efficiency. Let's vote that in. But we may need to vote in 100 new oracles. So that might take a certain period of time. People might need to consider that. So there's quite a few angles that need to be considered, even if the chance of them happening is remote or not as frequent as we think it's going to be. Because you're going to have different types of frequencies, generally with respect to when the system starts, there's going to be a whole bunch of initial votes to get things going. But as soon as things start developing in the ecosystem as well, and also the architecture as well, you might need a change in the code base, which might make things more efficient or run quicker. And MKR token holders need to think about voting that in as well. So to repeat myself, and I apologize for that, but Rich is right. It generally should be in the normal state of operations, risk teams, and their consideration about collateral. I hope I didn't bore you.
No, that was excellent. Chris, did that answer your questions? Do you have any follow-ups?
Yeah. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay, so something I mentioned before, and we're gonna. I remember talking about this, but I just want to touch on it again. There are three places where you want to keep your MKR tokens. One is in the voting construct, two is in your wallet, or three is in an exchange trying to get sold. Those are the three places where you effectively want to hold your MKR tokens. But theoretically speaking, and if you recall this, there should only be two. It should either be in the voting construct or you should be trying to sell them. And the reason I say that is because the system requires your constant attention. You need to be vigilant in terms of every single proposal that comes in, because it is you, as the MKR token holder, that decides the value that you're going to get. You are the reason that there's going to be value in the system. So if you do not see value in the proposals being put forward for yourself in order to vote them in, then you've got to consider the fact that there's no more value to be had. And if that's the case, your alternate option is to obviously sell your MKR tokens.
You mentioned this in the last meeting, sorry, and I've been pondering this for 2.5 weeks now because it was a new way of looking at things for me. Are you saying that people should engage in this behavior for their own benefit, or is this for the benefit of the ecosystem as a whole? This never holding maker unless you're voting with it. Well,
the thing here is that if you are benefiting the system, you're benefiting yourself. When you are voting, you can assume that you are voting for yourself, but you are implicitly voting for the system. If you see a proposal to include a new collateral type, and it is positively clear that that collateral type has got great amount of volume, great amount of value, and great amounts of daily turnover, this is a great collateral type to include because it's going to generate a large supply of DAI. So by default, you look at this as an MKR token holder and you go, I want to create more value for the system. This is how I do it. I release value from proposals. By making a proposal work, by voting it in and having it deployed as the new state of the system, I have released this value. I have created this myself. I have done this myself. No one else has done this. MKR token holders create their own value through releasing it through the manifestation of actual proposals. It is essential.
Sorry, but that means that for every time somebody wants to vote, if they dip in and out of the system, they're paying sort of the market price for governance voting. And potentially that's expensive.
Yeah, so in theory, what would happen is if every single MKR token holder consistently saw value in all proposals coming in, now this is just a theoretical edge case, then theoretically speaking, all 1 million MKR token holders should be sitting in the voting structure now and forever. In other words, there is absolutely nothing traded. So nobody knows exactly what the value of MKR tokens are. But that is preposterous. That is to believe that everyone is going to be so in agreement and so prophetic in understanding exactly what value is going to come into the system and when. That's not going to happen. So if they're not doing that, then they need to release themselves of the obligation to vote. And the way that they do that is to go and exchange their token. And I would think you go and exchange your token into DAI so that you can hold your value there, the value that you've seen, that you have given to the system through your votes. And then when you find a new slew of proposals coming in, which means there's new collateral types that are being considered, which means that there are new goods and services being provided on the blockchain, you might then say, this is a good time to then get back into this and actually start releasing the value from these new proposals that are going to be put forward. Or you may be more of an activist. You might say, well, let me go and take my DAI and go get MKR tokens and then get involved and say, guys, have you noticed that there's token HIJ over there? It's really amazing. It's trading like an absolute machine. It can really create a lot of value for the system. I would like to propose this. So in that proposal, you have identified the value for the system. You have proposed the value for the system. And if it does get included and passed, you have created value for the system. It's very important to understand this. MKR is a governance utility, a governance token. And what that means is that you create your own value. No one else is going to do it. No one else is going to go out there and go and do all the hard work of assessing. Folks are going to give you the information that you need, but ultimately you are the one that's going to decide whether you want to release the value from these proposals.
Steven, what are your thoughts on staking Maker in order to put forward a proposal? Like, it doesn't matter, like, you'll get it back whether or not the proposal passes or fails, but just for the sake of, like, maybe limiting the throttle of how many proposals can go through, what do you think about that?
That's being considered, and I would have to go and ask my good friends over there on the technical side, what their thoughts on actually implementing that is. But for now, for the sake of bootstrapping the system, I probably think it'd be easier just to have a look at proposals that have been put forward in order just to get a sense of how it all works. Once we've got some sort of critical mass and we've gone over that tipping point and we start finding, I think it was Chris that mentioned the previous concern. Once you find that proposals becoming kind of ridiculous, then yes, staking your MKR to actually put a proposal forward could be a good idea, because at least it gives you that sense of knowing that you are doing something where you are putting a certain amount of value locked up to say something, but ultimately you're not really staking it. I would hazard to go further to say that, what happens if you stake 1 MKR and you put forward an absolutely ridiculous proposal that is completely detrimental to the system? Who decides anything about that? And if that proposal is completely horrible, does that person lose their stake? The problem being is you've got this bifurcation of thinking that it needs to be more temporal. It's got to be a case of knowing what the situation is at the time before we can actually go ahead and consider it. So as it is now, flywheeling this the system into reality and then actually getting real value out of it, I probably think staking not quite now. Even just maybe in the medium term, not quite yet. Okay. Are there any other questions or?
I guess along those lines, Gavin was on the Epicenter podcast this week and was talking a little bit about governance around Ethereum in general, and I thought it kind of trickled down. But he mentioned kind of weighting votes instead of having an equal vote per share. And I was wondering kind of what your thoughts were on that, especially as we encourage people to keep their maker locked up in the voting contract. Is that something that you could accrue, not like actual maker points, but like more heavily weighted stake in the vote as you keep your maker in the contract longer? Would your vote be worth more like a year out from that initial locking?
So, to that point, which is it's a great question, and thank you for asking it. This actually comes down to a very simple premise of, plutocracy. You have to look at how anything starts. You generally have a case of whales in the system or cartels in the system. So therefore, you want to get some sort of real representation of the organization as a whole, as opposed to this implicit bias that you might garner from these whales or these cartels forming. So how do you actually sort of fight against that so you get better representation of what's good for the organization, as opposed to this, this inherent bias? Now, many folks have put a whole bunch of things forward, like how long you put your tokens in, the extent to which you want to stake them, maybe you can lose them. There's quite a few combinations. But the one thing I need to emphasize here is that the predominant amount of proposals that are being put forward are scientific in nature, are scientifically vetted. So you can't put forward a subjective, gee whiz, what do you think about this proposal? It effectively always comes down to a simple binary vote or a very clear assessment in terms of how a number or how basically a number is created. So what we've done is we've gotten rid, to a certain extent, these inherent factions that can be created, all these inherent problems that you generally find with a lot of voting structures. Because we've gotten rid of a lot of that, all we've done is said, well, you can only vote on what is seemingly logical and scientifically rational. And if we find that there is an inherent bias against it, that means there is some major form of bad action and bad actors that are trying to manipulate the system. So I hear what you're saying, and I think in a sort of a native token context, like in Ethereum, I would say that it makes sense because there is a broader subjectivity as to what you want to do. But in terms of what we're doing, we try to narrow the vision down to things that can be scientifically vetted appropriately, so that you're not going to get a bias as to someone's opinion on a matter, but something that is clearly more cogent towards being rational and very rigorous than subjective. So it's a bit of a long answer to your question, I apologize, but essentially we don't want to, as much as it is possible, we don't want to fall into that sort of public voting domain where you need to try and transform votes into what is representative of the organization.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Any other questions, or shall I continue, Rich?
I think we can move on, actually.
Okay, cool. What's our time frame? 10 minutes.
We have 10 minutes.
Okay. So the one thing I wanted to emphasize, just to wrap this whole thing up, what I've been implicitly talking about is MKR is a governance token, and as a governance token, you extract value out of it. That is essentially the message for today. There isn't some third party sitting in a office somewhere doing it on your behalf. There isn't a large company full of employees running around creating this value for you. MKR token holders create it for themselves. It's profoundly important that you understand this, because that is the essence of what a decentralized autonomous organization is. It is the realization that you are in charge of making the whatever value you wish this organization to have for yourself. And if you do not participate, it's because you have chosen not to be a part of the governance system. If you think that by just merely having MKR tokens, you just sit back and you wait for the value to go up, you are actually working against yourself. You're basically working against yourself, or you are effectively riding the coattails of people that are representing you, whether you like it or not. And if you do not participate, then those folks will represent you. You're effectively delegating your vote without even knowing it. So ultimately, by holding MKR tokens and not voting, you've already gone into a little bit of that sort of dark DAO, what can I put? How can I describe that? Dark DAO sort of landscape, because you can have a purposeful, call it bribery, where people will create a delegation of votes that point in a certain direction, but in this extent, your apathy is actually creating it for you. So to fight against that, it really is simply a case of just being up to speed with what the system is doing and how you can actually help extract value from it. Because
is there a corollary in the real world for this kind of activity, like in the non-crypto world, with ownership in a stock or something? Is this something new to crypto?
No, not that I know of, because the thing that is absolutely important here is that in the traditional finance space, you are always reliant on a third party to find the value for you and basically return the value to you. You are dependent on not only that third party, but you're also dependent on someone who is supposedly your representative, ensuring that this third party goes ahead and creates this value for you. Here, we've gotten rid of all of that. And we said that there's no third party. You are the person that goes and finds the value. And you are going to commission people to go and find the information you need so that you can make the decisions that best benefit the system. And then you're going to sit back and say, well, right, what else do I know? Well, I know that this token is great, but I'm not proficient at knowing this. Let me go find someone who is. Let them give me the information, and then once I get the information, and I think that it makes a lot of sense, I can make a decision. So this is really a case of MKR token holders identifying where the value is, informing themselves appropriately, and then making the inherent decision to extract the value from their findings. So the whole process is in the hands of MKR token holders. A governance token, especially the MKR governance token, is very much representative of how you, as a token holder, wish to extract value from the system. If nobody's interested, the system will reflect it. If everyone is interested and everyone sees the value, the system will reflect it. It's one of those things where you will always have a good idea of what your governing body thinks about the system, because it will always be reflected in the value. And that for me is the most novel characteristic about this. This is the first time I've seen, unless anyone else has a good example, where your vote can actually have a sense of value. It's almost as if you went to someone going to a general election and saying, well, are you about to cast your vote? And they go, yes, and of course I'm about to cast my vote. Okay, how much for your vote? And they'll go, well, I don't know. You know, do I really care about this election? What do I care about it? Who knows? And if someone says, how about $1,000? And they go, okay, well, it's $1,000. Yeah, sure, here's my vote. I don't care. Now, the point being there is that you have to have this very kind of gray, illicit, sort of uninformed area where you're thinking you actually don't know the value of your vote. You don't know the value that you have released from your vote. In this arena, you actually do. That's the difference. If you really want to know how much value you're going to release, go have a look at what the MKR value is. And
Wow, yeah, I'm going to be thinking about that for another week as well. So I guess there's kind of two different ways to measure the value of whatever the token happens to be trading at, I guess. And there is this longer term stability of the system, like the continued stability or the expansion of the system is the secondary consideration, but far harder to measure immediately, I assume.
Yep, I mean, it's the simplest thing is like your health. I mean, you're not waiting for, you know, a whole bunch of third parties out there to run around doing things that somehow are going to make you healthier. You effectively have to make your own decisions and act out those decisions to make sure that you remain healthy. And if you want to become bigger, stronger, better, faster, then you have to make those decisions and you have to put them into action. You may think, I don't know how to become faster, so you go read about how to go faster or how to run faster. And then once you've learned it, you incorporate it, you do it. The same thing here. Same thing with Maker. If you want it better, you got to go figure out how to do it, and you do it. You might find that you need to go and ask someone. You may need to go and find professionals who are very good at those specific things. And they inform you, and once you're informed, you make your decision.
Wow, that's great. I love these new paradigms. It's interesting to hear that there's no comparison or direct comparison in the legacy financial market.
Well, I don't know. It doesn't mean that there isn't. The financial markets is a large and strange beast. I've found that there are many things I never imagined could possibly be in financial markets being there. So I wouldn't say no completely. I just don't know of it.
Just imagine how all of us IT people and developers feel, having only discovered money exists recently. So there's a whole world to discover.
Okay, so shall I just leave it for any remaining questions, because I think we're about 3 minutes from the top of the hour.
Nick, are you still on the call? You had an interesting comment in the side chat there. Oh no, we lost. Oh, there he is. Nick, did you want to bring up any response?
I mean, it wasn't really its own question. It was just kind of Steven was going into different types of votes and different powers that MKR holders had, and I just kind of wanted to explain how something like a major piece of infrastructure changing would work. So the example we were using was, for example, a change in oracles. Not just in what individuals are running in Oracle, but a kind of code change on what algorithm they're using. So you could imagine like a shelling point type of game. And so the idea here is that you would have one kind of governance vote, really being a signaling mechanism, right? MKR holders desire this. Right, and then either the foundation or some kind of third party that's intrinsically motivated to do this, can go and build this new kind of software stack for oracles, and then there is an executive vote, right, to actually integrate the system, integrate this new module, on a code level, replace the existing Oracle module with the new Oracle module. So just kind of saying that this process is kind of like a two-step type of thing. It's not just an executive vote by itself. That's all I was trying to get at.
Cool, that's interesting. It was a topic we briefly touched on it a call 2 or 3 calls ago, I think, where somebody brought up the idea that in the future we might see independent groups of developers sort of organize themselves and say like, hey, we've figured out a better way of doing this and we'd like to have that implemented, which was a bit of a mind-blowing concept for me. It'd be interesting to see how that develops in the future.
I mean, but I also
sort of
think
like
that,
EIPs.
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say something sort of like EIPs in Ethereum. Maker would have its own version of that.
Yeah, MIPs, I think we were talking about for a while. Okay, I think that we're at the top of the hour and people are starting to drop off for other meetings. So thanks everybody for joining the call. That was great. Thank you, Steven, once again for some mind-blowing ideas. It's going to take me a while to process. We'll regroup again next week. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody come back.
Thanks, Rich.
Bye, guys. See you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, guys.